right, so we're into, I guess, session 4, third lesson. Now I think we're getting into the things that, I won't say that you came for, but more of the children and what that looks like from a Christian perspective, biblical perspective, spiritual perspective. And there's a couple passages I think that are really prevalent when it comes to children, because I'll be honest with you, there's not a whole lot in Scripture. There's just really a few commands given for raising children. I wrote those down in the notes. I don't know whether they made yours or not, but if not, don't provoke your children to wrath. Don't offend them or cause them to stumble. Bring them up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord, and then to train them up in the way that they should go. And so we're going to look at today Ephesians chapter 6 in verse number 3, and the pastor had mentioned this, and it's really important. This is important, and I've seen this so many times that I say 6:3. It's really, let's see, I didn't write that passage down. What is it? Verse number, where children provoke, or fathers provoke, with a 4. Okay, you're right. There it is. And it says, and you fathers provoke not your children to wrath, but bring them up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. Okay, so this is a command, and it is a command that is given to fathers. But I would say this, I've had moms look at me and say, oh, listen, that's to dads, that ain't to me. Okay, no, you're a unit, you're one. It's to both. It's to moms and dads. And I believe moms can provoke their children to wrath. Unfortunately, I've seen that. And so understand, it is a command, don't provoke your children to wrath. There's the first word there is ye. Now, I know this is simple, but I'm a simple person, and I like just sometimes the simple, obvious things there. When he says ye, it says, and I wrote this down, this was a letter written to a church, read in a church to parents present in the church. Okay, that's important. And also, verse 1, it says children. Okay, the same thing. What's that tell us? Children were there. They were expected to be there. As Paul wrote this letter back to the church at Ephesus, he's reading it, he's writing it, and then it was to be read. It was read in the church. And so the expectation was the children were there. And this might be a simple minor point in our church. We try to have the children in church one service a week. And for us right now, that's Wednesday nights. When the kids come, they come in, and the older kids, they come in and they sit with their mom and dads. For the teens, that would be Sunday morning. But we think it's important that the kids are in church a little bit so they see, what's going on, and they hear the preaching, they hear the pastor, and those things are to us really important. But I wrote this, just because you come to church and raise your children in church doesn't mean you, and I didn't put the R in there, you are doing right by them. All right? Church is important, and I'm 100% for that. I think church is important, but church is not the end all. Okay? I see a lot of parents every week, they bring their kids to church, and that's it. Church is not important. It's a check. They're checking the box. They don't encourage them in youth department. They don't encourage them to get involved. They don't encourage them in the community of the church. All right, and I think the community of the church is extremely important in all of our lives. And as I look back on my kids, they were obviously. Some of them were part of Ben's youth department when he was at our church. I think that's one of the key things for kids is being involved in church. And so when Paul wrote this letter and it's being read in the church, it's read to dads and moms. He said, listen, fathers, don't provoke your children to wrath. Well, what does that mean? because that's important. So to me, and this is in your notes, provoking to wrath is a repeated pattern, and that's important. We talked about mistakes. We're going to make mistakes as parents. There's mistakes that I made, but it's not as much the mistakes we made, it's are we repeating those things over and over and over again. It's a repeated pattern of treatment that gradually builds up a deep-seated anger and resentment that boils over into outward hostility. When we talk about the wrath here, provoking our kids to wrath, it's the seething hostility. It's like under the surface. It's like a pot on a stove that, you got soup or something or water, and it's just, you just see that just a little bit. It's really what's coming out is not really what's inside. There's a big hot pot in there, and every once in a while it'll pop a little bit and you'll see the steam come up. So we've got to be careful that we do not provoke by a repeated pattern of bad decision-making, bad patterns in our life and our parenting that will cause our kids to be resentful later on. And I wrote some notes down here, just kind of, we're going to mess up. That's why we need grace too. This anger doesn't always show up when they're young. That's true. I've seen very complicit kids, they don't express themselves, they're introverted, and sometimes you don't see that anger or that wrath come till later, and it may not always be in the same way that others. It may not be an outward anger, maybe it's just an inward resentment that maybe the kids don't want to have anything to do with church. They don't want to have anything to do with the relationships at home anymore. There's just a change in them that maybe they don't all handle it the same, but it results in negative behaviors and negative consequences for them spiritually and otherwise. I put this down. We can't control what our children do later in life, but we sure have an influence. We do have an influence. And that's what we're trying to do, is influence our kids in the right way. Control, and I think I'll mention this a little bit, but I'll just kind of mention this later, but I'll say this here. Parenting is not about control. We can't control our kids. Oh, you say, well, yeah, you can. I was controlled. No, we are not to control. We're to influence, we're to lead, and we're to guide. It's an illusion when we think we can really control, because control is if it's just about behavior, yeah, we can make them behave. But it's more to that. Raising kids is more than a behavior that we expect. We're trying to shape and build hearts and minds. Okay, not control them, but shape them. And so as parents, our goal is to do that, to shape and mold our kids' hearts and minds and spirits and soul to be what God wants it to be. And of course, He's in charge of that ultimately. And I've learned this: we can do everything right. That's no guarantee. And that'll be tonight's lesson. But what provokes our children to wrath? And so I wrote down a lot of these, and that'll be the rest of our lesson in this session. And I wrote down, and this list is a list that I have taught this verse several times in the years that I've been a pastor, and my lists have changed, mostly been added to. I've also kind of revamped it a little bit as more I grow and more I learn and see and counsel and experience different things as culture changes. There's some things that I'll mention here that I wouldn't have mentioned 20, 30 years ago because they weren't as relevant, and maybe they weren't even didn't exist in that time. So we're just going to go through these. I think you've got them in your list, but I don't know that you got all the notes I do. So I'm going to just go through these and mention a few things as we go. Number one, not allowing our children to express their anger, not allowing our kids to express their anger. I grew up in an environment, and I would call it a family culture, and maybe even in some church culture, where parents, if a child got angry, you stopped it. You did not. It was not common to allow a child in our culture. And I'm not saying this is right. I don't believe it's right. A child couldn't get angry, because if they got angry, I think parents looked at that as a hit on them, and so they would quickly tell that kid, "Don't you get mad? You stop it right now." And I'll have to be honest with you. I kind of fell into that because that's what I was raised in. That's kind of the way my dad raised me, I was a very complicit kid. I knew exactly what my dad was, and I knew not to get upset around my dad because it made him mad. And I was a people pleaser from the time I was this tall, and I didn't want to upset anybody. And I still struggle with that today as a people pleaser, people pleasing pastor. But that's another story. But it's okay for your kids to get angry. Matter of fact, the Bible says, be angry and sin not. Okay, be angry and sin not. I think anger is something that it's an emotion, and it's something that we experience, and we have to learn to deal with it. And as parents, it's our job to help our children deal with emotions. This is related but not related. I see in churches today where a lot of churches are, it's an emotion-driven church, an emotion-driven worship. Emotions, to me, in a lot of churches have too much to do with what happens, and everything is about feeling something instead of knowing and learning something. And where do we teach that? We teach that at a young age, how to control the emotions, having emotions in their right place in our lives. I think sometimes we adults don't. I think sometimes we are governed by emotions, and we let emotions guide us and direct us in our decision-making process. I see that time and time and time again in churches with families and with people. We're driven by emotions. I've heard this said, and I believe it. I've used it many times. Emotions make a good passenger in life, but never a good driver. But we struggle sometimes. And can I say this, and I don't want to be offensive, and a lot of times we find that the emotional ones is a lot of times the ladies, because they're more emotional driven than the men. And so we just need to allow our kids to express their anger, and we can do that by developing a good communication, allowing them to express their anger in proper ways. I was not good at that. My son Aaron is really good at that. I've watched him, and it's neat to watch your kids parent. And his son Hudson, he is an emotional kid, and if he doesn't get what he wants, he will get angry and he'll cry. And my son handles it great. I love it. I love to see it. He's far better than I was. He will say, now Hudson, why are you angry? And he'll have a little talk with him, and he said, well, you have no reason to be angry. It's not really something you should be right now. And he'll have this little talk with him, and then Hudson will cheer up and he'll be fine. Whereas when I was Aaron's age with a child Hudson's age, I would have said, you need to stop it. Stop it. Just quit it. And that would have been wrong, because we need to allow our children to express their anger, but help them to express it in the right way. That to me is important. We've all been around people who express their anger in wrong ways. That's hurtful. Okay, we can express it in the right way. If I get angry, we can sit down and have a conversation, and we can discuss it. Those are things that I think we need to teach. And if we don't allow our children, that anger will build up and build up over time. Number 2, having double standards. Now, you would see that and you'd probably say, okay, he's talking about having a double standard for this kid versus that kid. It's not what I'm talking about, double standard. When I say double standard, I mean having a different standard for your children than you have for yourself. Now, you say, whoa. I am an adult. You're right. You are an adult. But when it comes to certain things, you are under the same set of guidelines that they are under, right? So if we say, and here's, for instance, if we tell our kids, listen, don't lie. You shouldn't lie, right? I mean, we would tell our kids, don't lie. But then someone calls on our phone, well, back when we had home phones, don't have them anymore, but when someone calls and you tell your wife, if that's so-and-so, tell them I'm not here. You say, yeah, but listen, kids pick up on everything. If it's wrong for them to lie, then it's wrong for you to lie. I mean, and if they see you doing that, but then you say, don't lie, what have we done? We've created a double standard, and they say, oh, I see how this works. You're allowed, I'm not. So when I get to be older, I can do what I want, and it's okay. Okay, so we need to be careful of that. If it's wrong for them to disrespect people, it's wrong for you to do it as well. And I would say your spouse. If your kids see you disrespecting your spouse, they will pick up on that. I have seen this so many times. I can mention names right now in my mind where I see a husband who belittles his wife, and the children will belittle the mom the same way. And it's like, you just want to go up and say, what are you doing? Don't do that. And double standards. Are you doing anything your kids would get in trouble for? Sin is sin no matter who does it. The old saying, do as I say, not as I do. Sorry, but that doesn't work. Now, I do think there are guidelines for kids that we as parents, my kids would, if we had, when they were younger, they had bedtime, 9 o'clock. That was our relief. So they went to bed at 9. Stacy and I could actually have some peace and quiet, maybe watch a little TV, talk a little bit. That was our time. It's not like, well, Mom and Dad, I got to go to bed at 9. You got to go to bed at 9. No, that's different. Okay, but we're talking about the things that are right and the things that are wrong, the things that we want our kids to grow up and understand in character and morality. If we can't do it, how can we expect them? And later on, that's going to cause problems. The third one, being too restrictive. I grew up in a church environment in my previous church that was very restrictive. Kids were pretty much told, you can't do this, you can't do that, don't do this, don't do that. And the rules were so tight on kids, and it was considered to be the way to do it, that they had no room to move. They had no room to be themselves. And listen, when I say restrictive, I think it's good for kids to have structure. I think it's good to establish guidelines in the home, but I think they ought to be based on the Bible. I do. I think and what's appropriate for them in their age. And so we can be too restrictive. We can rule our kids to death, especially with unnecessary and unbiblical rules. Be careful of that. I've seen this. And I know I say that a lot, but I've seen these things so many times. I've seen parents that raise their children and they put so many rules and restrictions on them, they can't do anything. And then they hit 18, they graduate from high school, and they go to college, and it's like, woohoo, I have no rules, I have no regulations, I have nobody I have to check in with. And they go absolutely crazy. And there, they don't have somebody saying, okay, don't do that, don't do this, don't go out with those people, don't go drinking, don't go out and do that or this. And, okay, if you are so rule and strict, one day when they're out on their own, what are they going to do? And again, that can provoke our children to wrath. I would also say this: allow your kids to make mistakes, age-appropriate mistakes. Okay, that's how they learn. When you read Ephesians chapter 6 and verse number 4, he says, "But bring them up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord." The word admonition simply means don't do that. Don't do that. Well, how does that work out? Well, to me, it could be, all right, kids, don't do this, or it could be you have done this, but don't do that again. Okay, so there's a presumption here. I may think there's a good presumption that your kids are going to make mistakes. Allow them to make some mistakes. We allowed our kids, age appropriate, to make mistakes, because then we can come in and say, hey, look, you did this wrong. Here's what you should have done. Let's talk about it. And, of course, we would try to tie it back into the Word of God, but they would make mistakes. And if they got older, we'd allow them to make more mistakes, and sometimes bigger mistakes, because it's an opportunity for us to teach. It's an opportunity for us to show them, okay, you did this, but maybe you should have done this instead. And mistakes are good. How many of us don't learn from our mistakes? We do. I learn more from my mistakes than I do my successes a lot of times. Your kids are the same way. And again, you're establishing a pattern for them that, okay, when I do make mistakes, here's what I need to go. Here's where I need to go. And we teach them as God teaches them. I wrote this down. You can't, and I said this earlier, you can't control, but you can guide. You can't control them, but you can guide them. And that's, as parents, that's what we're doing. We're guiding. I don't know how many of you like NASCAR. I know we're in the South, so maybe NASCAR is a little more. We got NASCAR. I used to love Jeff Gordon. I know not everybody likes Jeff Gordon. He was a good guy racing for a long time. It kind of got more popular after Dale Earnhardt was killed. But I used to watch racing all the time. Every Sunday after church, I'd go home, and if there was a race on, I'd be watching it. And the thing about NASCAR racing or IndyCar racing, it doesn't matter. You always have spotters. And every now and then they would put the spotters on the air as they were communicating with the drivers. And it was the job of the spotter to help the driver see things he couldn't see. And so, like, a car driver, he's in there, he's going 160, 180 miles an hour, and maybe 200 or 300 yards in front of him, there's something going on that he needs to know about. So it would be the job of the spotter to watch the race, and he would be at the highest point on the track with all the other spotters, communicating with the driver to say, okay, go left, go right, take the high line, take the low line. Or he would communicate things that the driver couldn't see, and he needed to know. Well, when I think about it, as parents, we are kind of like the kids' spotters. Don't do this, don't do that, do this, do that, and help them as they navigate life. And while we got them, it's important that we help them do that, because, as I said earlier, when we don't have them anymore, someone else is going to be their spotter. And that should be God. So we're training them to be guided first by us and then by God in their relationship with Him. Moving on. Being too giving. I see parents sometimes giving their kids far more than what they probably need to have. Kids never want for anything, and that's not good. I told you there's some things that maybe are different that I would add to this list. I was watching, I like Fox News. I know some do, some don't, but I was watching Fox News, and they had this expert on, and he was talking about, I've got mine in my bag over there, smartphones with kids. And it's interesting, 30-some% of, and I think the age, I'm not 100% sure, was like 10 to 18 or 12 to 18, that 33% of all kids have what we would call an addiction to their phones. They can't put them down. When I was going through the pandemic, and a lot of the pandemic revealed a lot of things. I learned a lot through the pandemic about people and fear and how they cope with different things. I had two parents came to me and says, I don't know what to do. My child is addicted to their phone. I want to take it away from them, but I can't, because they go crazy when they can't get on social media and see what everyone else is doing. And then they said, what do I do? How do I handle that? We've got to be careful what we put into our kids' hands. Back when I was a kid and my kids were kids, we didn't have smartphones. It wasn't a problem. I'm so glad, because if I would have had a smartphone, oh my, the things that I would have probably been involved with would not have been good, because I was a teenage boy. And if I would have had that phone, who knows what would have been on it. And listen, we can say, well, I've got this safeguard and this safeguard, and they won't allow my kids to get on this site or that site. I got schooled with some of our teenagers a few years ago that were getting on things through other ways that mom and dad, and as a pastor, you hear all this stuff, because everybody wants to tell the pastor what's going on in other people's lives. And so we had teenagers that were getting places they shouldn't be by going through what seemed to be normal apps on their phone, but would get them into other things. And I'm like, how do these kids know that? They have a familiarity with that phone, with that smartphone that I don't have. And so there's just so many things, and a lot of the experts, the worldly experts, the worldly counselors will tell you that probably a teenager shouldn't have a cell phone until they get to be 17 or 18 years of age. Now, I think most of you are younger, with younger kids. You do need to really think about that, because giving your kids that access to everything that's there is not always a good thing. Giving kids what they want. I've noticed a lot of kids today, when I say kids, I'm kids that have grown up but now are in their 20s and early 30s that had a lot growing up and were given a lot. They have this sense of entitlement about them, and they feel like they deserve everything that their parents had when they were like 17 or 18. I'm talking about when the kids were 17, they see their parents and they had the nice home, the nice car, the nice clothes. They had all these things. And so these kids, I call them kids, they're 19, 20, 21 years of age. They get married and they think they should have all this stuff too, because mom and dad made sure they have it. And so they then will a lot of times feel like they should have everything that their parents have, which causes a lot of problems, because debt, the sense of entitlement, it creates, I believe, in kids that they feel like they deserve it. If you, and this kind of goes along with it, if you as a parent teach your kids that they are the most important thing, they're going to grow up to believe they're the most important thing. And that's not going to stop when they get married or they go off to college. It creates this attitude that they are the most important thing. So teenagers that have been taught that they're the most important thing by their parents will be young adults and young married couples that believe they're the most important thing. And that's not healthy for our kids. And again, provoking them to wrath. Making your kids the most important thing in your life, and I kind of alluded to that. If you teach them they're the most important, they're going to think they're the most important, and they will be entitled, prideful, and have an exaggerated self-worth. And then I put this down: don't let them have too much to say in the home. Can I vent a little bit? I have had parents that allowed the kids to pick the church that they're going to attend. We've had people come in, and we try to have good programs for kids, but a lot of times the kids want to go somewhere else where their friends are. And I have sat down with many parents and said, well, our kids want to go here. But they're the kids. You're the parents. I know, but we want our kids to be happy. We want our kids to be like church. But you're the parent. Why are you letting your kid make this decision as to where you are going to church? And I've had this more than once, many, many times. Parents have given their kids too much say-so, and they let them actually control the family. That is not good. It's not going to be healthy, and again, will provoke them to wrath. Then the other end of that is not making them important enough. We need to sacrifice for our kids. It's important that they see us giving and maybe doing without so they can have. That's sacrifice. That's, if I'm not mistaken, that's agape love, sacrificial love. We sacrifice for our kids. Growing up in my house when I was a kid, we had a lot. My dad did very well. He was self-employed. He had a well drilling business. We had pretty much whatever we wanted. When Stacy and I got married, I worked for my dad for 7 years. And I didn't I didn't make what he made, so we struggled. Then I got into ministry, and it got worse. We didn't have a whole lot. There were Christmases where we would spend $150 a piece on the kids, and Stacy and I would get nothing. I still today, unless somebody buys them for me, I buy shoes that cost $25 or less. And some of you younger parents will understand if you're not able to do that, you'll sacrifice for your kids so they can have. My kids got better shoes than I did. They got better clothes than I did. Matter of fact, Stacy and I went to, this is how much it's affected me. We went out of town. We went to Berlin, Ohio, which is an Amish area in Ohio. And one of the places we stop is Goodwill or thrift stores. I bought several pieces of clothes, and they're good clothes, name brand stuff, but people get rid of them, and I can buy them for. I still do that, and it's a lot of the same. I don't want to spend the money, but I still sacrifice for my kids and my grandkids so they can have, and I think that's important for them to see that. Not making them important enough. So let them see you sacrifice. Improper discipline. I kind of addressed this earlier. We don't punish, we discipline. Make it fit the crime. I've seen parents really go overboard, and they just hammer their kids for something little. And I'm thinking, why are you doing that? I shared last night of the 22-year-old who got her phone taken away because she didn't clean her room properly. That 22-year-old wants so bad right now to get out of the house that they moved their wedding up about 7 months so they can get out. Tell me that hasn't provoked some wrath in that child, that child doesn't even want to be in the home anymore? Something is going on there. Improper discipline. I think that grace is important, and we need to show grace and mercy, because grace and mercy have been extended to us, that we should extend it to our kids and show them what it's about. Next, performance-based acceptance, or as this commonly called, PBA. this is a hard one because we condition our kids for this. Think about this, and I know Pastor Charlie and Skylar have got a little one, and this is something we do. We did it. I'll do it with my grandkids, have done it with my grandkids. And they get to that point where they're about a year and a half, they're going to start learning to walk, right? So this to me is one that sticks out. So when my kids or my grandkids started to learn to walk, what did we do? Well, we would reach out for them, and they'd start to walk, and then they would make it to us. And what do? We'd made such a big deal out of it. And so our kids, a lot of times, we make big deals out of their successes. I've watched parents make big deals out of athletics and academics and successes in different areas of life. And I'm not saying we shouldn't. I think when our kids do well, we should encourage them. But we also don't want them to think that the things they do make them who they are. As believers, we should understand that God does not accept us in performance-based acceptance. In other words, we are accepted and loved unconditionally, right? So we should do the same thing for our kids. It shouldn't be, well, you can do this and you can do that. I've seen parents where their kids were athletes and they got all the accolades from their parents. I know one. We've got one in our church right now. Their oldest son was a stud athlete, football player, state champion. And now they got a younger son who didn't have that academic or that athletic ability, nor the academic ability that the older brother had. And you talk about a child that is provoked to wrath. The older one was the kid. The younger one couldn't accomplish that, and so he was not accepted and I will say this, he wasn't loved like the other one was because he couldn't do what the older kid did. And so it affected him in a really, really, really big way. And he today won't have anything to do. He just he's got to do summer school. He won't have anything to do with his dad. And he really didn't have anything to do with his mom. It's sad. It's extremely sad. So performance-based acceptance. And I could say a lot about that. Be careful about making your love and acceptance for your kid about what they do. We're to expect them or love them and respect them and care for them and accept them because of who they are. And God's that way, and we should be that way too. Favoritism. I think this question came up. How do we do that? How do we walk through that? And when I think about favoritism, I think of a couple brothers in the Bible that one was favored by their dad and the other one was favored by their moms. Anybody know who I'm talking about? Jacob and Esau. Jacob was favored by who? Anybody remember? His mom. Exactly. Esau was favored by his dad. And so, you see what that happened in that relationship and how it created so many problems in the family because mom favored one, dad favored the other one, and it caused a lot of friction and problems within the home. And so favoring your kids, don't favor your children. Treat them as equals. A lack of encouragement, the next one, a lack of encouragement. Encourage your kids. Build them up. We're told to encourage one another. God tells us that. It's sad. At one point in my life, my wife said, you do a better job at encouraging your church people than you do your family. That was a big ouch. And so what I do, I try to make sure that I encourage my children, even my adult children. I try to encourage them in what they're doing. If I see them doing something good, for instance, and I've got a son-in-law that he's about 26, 27, and we are we're building, he's building a house. I'm going to be building a house. We bought property together, and we're going to build a house. He's going to start this summer, me probably next summer. And he's getting his land ready and everything, and he's wanting to get started. He works at the A plant, which is used to be an old atomic plant. They would make nuclear energy and then use it for sometimes bomb grade or energy grade. Now it's not bomb grade anymore. It's just, and they're actually taking the place apart. But he works at the A plant, and he only gets like 2 to 3 weeks of vacation every year. Well, our teens are going to camp, and him and my daughter are youth counselors. And my daughter just had a baby, so she's not going to go. Now, he's going to be building a house, and he needs every single day off to work on that house. But you know what he did? He is going to camp as a camp counselor without my daughter. Now, as his father-in-law, you know what I did? I spent some time with him the other day, and I told him, I said, you know, I want you to know what you're doing is a very spiritual thing. And I want you to know I appreciate it. I see that, not just as your pastor, but as your father-in-law, to see you grow that way. And you could just see that as I encouraged him in that, it just kind of like, oh, it helped him. Now, we need to do it here too. You don't stop encouraging your kids, but you need, when they do something good, encourage them in that. When they don't, encourage them to do better. Okay, encouraging your kids, a lack of that can provoke them to anger. Negativity. I shared with you one of my pet peeves. I am not a negative person. I was raised by a negative dad who was raised by a negative mom. My grandma was extremely negative. Everything was negative, negative, negative. My dad, though he probably would disagree, kind of caught that, and he can be a very negative person. I would call him a downer in a lot of ways. I can only take so much because age kind of, I've found that age kind of brings that out more and more and more. But we need to be very careful as parents that we are not negative. When I say negative, don't be negative about their teachers. Don't be negative about their coaches. And I've been on both sides of that. I've been a parent of a kid who plays sport. All 4 of our children played sports. And and sometimes maybe they weren't treated right by their coaches. We were very, very, very careful in how we handled that. I was also a coach baseball in Wheelersburg for several years, different levels from high school all the way down into the little kids. And that negativity, I would hear it from parents, why won't you let my kids play? And, it affected the kids' relationship with me. Bosses, leaders in our country. As parents, we got to be careful what we say about our leaders in our country. I disagree with a lot of things. But when our kids were younger, I tried to keep that to myself, that there needs to be a respect for leadership. Why? Because the Bible says so. Leave it at that. We don't have to agree with our leaders, but we should show a level of respect to them. Don't always be negative. Facebook has created so much negativity. Everybody feels free to express, and most of the time it's negative. Don't do that. Church leadership. Oh, boy. Be careful of what you say about your pastor. Be careful what you say about your youth pastor or your children's pastor, because if your kids are listening, they're going to hear that. And they love you. They respect you. You're the authority. If they hear you negatively talking about your pastor, your youth pastor, the children's pastor, a leader in the church, what do you think they're going to get from that? They're going to adopt that same negativity towards them. And when it comes time, you think they're going to have any respect for that person? No. And if you don't respect your pastor and leaders in the church, how can you ever be led by them? And so it's important not to be negative towards leaders in the church. Don't be negative towards other people in the church. Man, be careful about that. Your kids will pick up on that. And I would say also your regular family too. Be careful how you talk about grandparents and siblings. And I've got some now that they are just constantly warring with each other in the family. And, the grandkids and the kids pick up on that, and they're like, And again, all these things have negative consequences. And then the third point in this, and we'll be done, it's what provoking leads to. And in chapter 4, verse number 31, which is kind of some of the negative stuff that Paul says, listen, leave that behind. It will lead to that. In chapter 4, verse 31, it says, let all bitterness, wrath, anger, clamor, and evil speaking put away with you with all malice. What we need to be careful of is when we provoke our kids to anger, a lot of times it will lead to this right here, this bitterness and the wrath. And, we could go through what all those mean, but it's anger in different ways. It's things that happen under the surface and the way we handle things and outbursts and stuff like that. So we've got to be careful that we don't lead our kids in such a way that causes them to be provoked to anger. And I wrote this down. I think you have it in your notes. We will raise our children to be what's inside of us. That's so true. We are called, and we will reproduce. I believe reproduction is, yes, physical, but also it's spiritual. We will reproduce in our children what we are. Your kids, in some way, shape, or form, will reflect you. That can be positive or that can be negative. That's our choice. Like I said, we are going to make mistakes. I think God understands that because of the world we live in. I do want to say this, though, and I feel like I need to, and maybe not for any of you, but maybe if this goes out somewhere along the line, when we talk about parenting, and I've talked about marriage, and we know marriage is 2, and parenting is 2, but I also want to say this, that maybe someone may be listening, and I don't think it applies to any of you from what I know about you, which isn't much. There isn't always 2 parents in a home. Sometimes there's single parent homes. And we may say, well, this stuff has really left me out because maybe I'm divorced, or maybe I'm a single parent who had a child out of wedlock, and all of these things. Well, that doesn't apply to me. Listen, it does apply to you. And you may be a single parent. You may be a divorced parent raising children. Listen, all these things apply to you too. And I want to say this, just because you may be a single parent raising a child doesn't mean that you can't have great kids. It doesn't mean you can't have biblical kids and spiritual kids, saved kids, and kids that are not provoked to anger. You can have all that too. You say, but I don't have maybe a dad or a mom in this house. And so how can we? Because of grace and because God fills the gaps. And we just need to do what we're supposed to do. It all goes back to us being what we need to be, and God, in that situation, will give grace to us and to our kids so that we can have the kids that God wants to, even with our circumstances. And unfortunately, we live in a world today where single parents, we've got a lot of single parents in our church raising children. And listen, there is just as much hope for them as there is for those with a mom and a dad in the home. Do things God's way. Now, that doesn't mean that there won't be some issues that have to be dealt with down the road, but God will give you the wisdom to deal with those if you ask and if you seek Him. Father, thank you for the lesson. Help us to be the parents and the grandparents that you've called us to be, and we'll thank you for all that you do in Jesus' name. Amen.